Welcome to our mobile tech talk about the mobile test pyramid. During this talk, we are going to explain in which way you could use our continuous testing cloud when you need to automate mobile, web, hybrid, or even native apps. But first, let's take a look at the agenda. We're going to start with an introduction to the mobile test pyramid, followed by a deep dive into each level. The deep dive will handle pros, cons, best practices, and some examples on how to use the mobile test pyramid. This talk is based on the mobile test pyramid made by a good friend of mine. His name is Quo Ding, and I had the pleasure of working with him for a few years at a large bank in the Netherlands. When I was a QA consultant in 2014, Quo and I were working together in an IT for IT team for the online department, and we had the assignment to support all 12 feature teams in automating the new web and hybrid app. It was a greenfield for us, and during that time, Quo created the basis of his mobile test pyramid. I'm a real fan of his mobile test pyramid, and I use it a lot in newer assignments. As you will see, I also use it when customers ask me how to utilize their browsers, emulators, simulators, and real device in combination with our continuous testing cloud. But enough about Quo. Let's start diving into the mobile test pyramid. When some people start testing mobile web, hybrid, and/or native apps, most people start with getting some real devices and install the app. Then they do some cool manual testing, and at the end of the day, they put it in the locker. This is a strategy that works. But what if you get more and more issues from production? And even more interesting, how would you implement that manual testing strategy in a continuous improvement and continuous development environment? How will you gain the fast feedback with manual testing? The answer is simple. You need to look at other possibilities than manual testing. If you look at mobile testing, then you have some other challenges compared to web UI testing, where you only have some cross-browser challenges. As you can see, mobile testing doesn't only need to cover the UI aspects, but also the compatibility of hardware, networking connectivity, operating system flavors, especially on Android, and so on. In order to reach fast feedback and lower amounts of manual testing, a better usage of the available tools is necessary. To gain that fast feedback, there are different things you could utilize in your mobile test strategy. So we have real devices, as we call it, the real thing, emulators and simulators. And I think this is the most underestimated part. And browsers, the desktop browsers with mobile emulation. Keep in mind that when we're talking about emulators and simulators, we are talking about the Android emulator and iOS simulator. If we are talking about desktop browsers with mobile emulation, we are talking about resized browsers where we change the user agents. We will walk through the pros and cons of using each option, give you some examples on how to use them, and hopefully give you a good insight in what to test where. But first, let's go back to the basics. We all know the test pyramid. We start with unit test, then service test, and in the end, the leftovers for the UI. Each layer becomes smaller, meaning more unit tests, then less service tests, and even less UI tests. This is for gaining the fast feedback. If we're talking about mobile, we're talking more about UI tests with different factors which we need to take into account. Think about my first slide about layout, device, networking issues, and so on. So in the end, we can create a new test pyramid based on the top layer. That pyramid will be called the mobile test pyramid. But before we're going to dive into the mobile test pyramid, we need to set some guidelines. The following guidelines are very generic, and I think guidelines everybody should keep in the back of their mind. Try to test as isolated as possible, so try to limit the disturbance of environmental issues. Automate as much as possible. This is a contradiction of no risk is no test, but each test should add a value for the customer, for the business, so only automate that would have the most risk or would cost the most money if it breaks. Zero tolerance on flakiness means that if you run the same test 100 times in the same environment with the same test data and same conditions, then you want the same results every time. CI and CD is all about fast feedback, so start with that as early as possible. Non-functional requirements. Keep in mind, if people are using an app that looks great, but has a very bad performance, people will delete the app if we're talking about a hybrid or native app, or never visit your site again, and you will lose customers. Losing customers means losing money. The mobile test pyramid is, just like the test pyramid, a tool that can help you determine the best test strategy for retrieving fast feedback. It contains 4 layers. At the bottom, you will have the desktop browsers with mobile emulation. This only applies when you're automating a web or a hybrid app. Then you have the mobile emulators and simulators. And at last, the real devices spread over two layers. One layer for usability and more functional testing, and the second, the top layer, is for the non-functional requirements. We will walk through the pros and cons of using each layer, give you some examples on how to use that, and hopefully give you a good insight in what to test where. So let's start with the desktop browsers with mobile emulation. And keep in mind, this only applies when you're automating a web or a hybrid app. If you have a native app, you can skip this layer. Browsers can give you fast feedback because they can run tests in a matter of seconds. They're easy to scale, so you can spin up 10 browser instances to parallelize your test. You can even do this cross-platform. There are also some cons. For example, there is no native integration like the native drop-down list, incoming calls, and stuff like that. This means that you're limited here, and those tests should go to the next level. But still, it's fast. So if you want to test the functional flow for a web or a hybrid app, you could start here. So where should you focus on when you have the opportunity? For system testing, you should focus on isolated browser tests performing full functional validations. For responsive design, you can, for example, create a helper that will check if elements are above each other and so on. You can also change the user agents to see what the impact of them is on your web or your hybrid app. For cross-browser, you can, for example, use Safari on a Mac and Chrome on a Linux machine. Overall visual layout can, as it says, give you an overall visual overview, but be aware, it will give you a good impression, but don't rely on it. It will show you that with an example. But first, let's start with a simple example. When you use an emulated mobile browser, you can resize the screen and change user agents. Let's take a look at Booking.com. First of all, resizing the screen will place elements in a different order. This can be tested in this phase with element positioning, meaning is element B below element A. Booking.com also uses their user agent to determine two things. First, which layout to show, and secondly, if the app download bar needs to be shown. Here you can see they use a different layout for iPhones than for a desktop. They also add the app download bar at the bottom. We can also see that there's a different layout for iPads. After resetting some data, we're going to visit Instagram. If you look at Instagram, they're using resizing for hiding or showing elements, and they're using user agent to show the app bar at the top. So this is how you can use mobile emulated browsers. As I said, I will get back on the overall visual layout. Here you have 3 examples that will show you that you should not rely on the visuals. Take, for example, the first screenshot. This is from a Chrome emulated browser. Here you will not see the user menu and the main menu. The second screenshot is on the Safari emulated browser. There you will see the user menu and the main menu. The last one is on the simulator. Here you have the best experience. So keep in mind, the tests that you execute in this phase are really fast and should only focus on the functional testing, responsiveness, and changing the user agent in combination with some default overall layout testing. So now let's take a look at the emulators and simulators. If you look at manual or local testing, the emulators and simulators are easy to set up, at least if you have a Mac to use the iOS simulators, or a Mac, Linux, or a Windows machine to download and set up the Android emulators. If you have a Sauce Labs account with desktop browsers, you can already start using them. The emulators and simulators are easy to scale, especially in our continuous testing cloud. They also support the native APIs like calls, GPS, native elements, and so on. One of the cons is that you don't have full Android manufacturer support on the OS itself. Apple is almost close to a real device, but Android is still stock Android. You can hardly use emulators and simulators for non-functional requirements, like for example, performance. Without doing some tweaks, you still use the resource of the host machine. And you can't test NFC, Bluetooth, and so on. But how should you use the emulators and simulators? You can first use them to walk through the app with the user flows. There you have the native integrations like the real OS drop-down, GPS, incoming calls, and so on. For visuals, you are already closer to the truth, so you can focus more on the bigger picture and do some visual comparison here. But keep in mind that there is a limitation for Android regarding the fact that they only have stock versions, and you don't test the Samsung skins here, for example. The touch actions can be tested here. Keep in mind that you need to try to scroll here with a swipe when you test the site, not with a JavaScript function. So try to mimic the real user behavior here. There's one extra thing I want to say before we're going to look at how to use the native APIs. If you're going to automate the native API, I would advise you to first check the Appium docs to see what you can and what you cannot automate on Android and iOS. Take, for example, the text method. This works on Android, but it does not work on iOS. Here, you see an example of changing the GPS location from San Francisco to my hometown in the Netherlands and back. We will also deny an incoming call and get a text message. This is an example of what you can do with the native APIs on an Android phone. So now let's take a look at the real thing. Here you have the native API in real conditions like NFC, Touch ID, and so on. But this can only be used for manual testing. So when you have the device in your hand. Some devices are faster than emulators, especially the latest devices from Samsung and Apple in comparison to emulators and simulators or the 3 or 4 year old devices people have. And yeah, it's the real thing. If we look at some cons, then we see that real comes with a price. But not only the price might become a con, also the availability of a new device can become a con. Normally this will take some days, but we already proved that we can deliver the newest iPhones with release day delivery in our continuous testing cloud. And last but not least, an iOS app for a simulator does not need to be signed. But for real devices, you need to have a developer license to be able to deploy the app on a real device. So how should you utilize real devices? Also here you have the usability checks on phones. Automate the swipes, touches, and native components to get a better idea of the usability. Performance should also be tested here, just like the native APIs. If we're talking about the visuals, then you can focus here on all the components or overviews that are really different on the real device in comparison to emulators and simulators, the leftovers as we call them. We also advise to run a simple happy flow on brands that have their own manufacturer sauce, just to be sure that everything still works. Keep in mind that Appium works awesome with Chrome and Safari, but they don't fully support the native browsers that are provided, for example, Samsung. They have their own implementation and might give problems during automation in comparison to Chrome. But what will happen if we look at automating real devices? Then we have less to check. As said, you can check non-functional requirements with real devices. And in our testing cloud, you can retrieve the device vitals for iOS and Android after test execution of your mobile app. You only need to provide an extra capability when starting the device. As a result, you will get a download button where you can download a CSV file. The CSV file could look like this. Performance specialists would like to have these numbers to determine the performance of the app. You can check the CPU, the memory usage, and so on. These numbers can give you a good idea about how your app is performing on a real device. The advice is to do this on a range of devices that your customer would use, and not only test this on the high-end devices, which are always the fastest. So if we would summarize the slides, you can use the mobile test pyramid as a mobile test strategy. We've looked into desktop browsers here. In case you need to test a web hybrid app, you should focus on system testing and responsive design by changing the size and the user agents. We've seen that you can get fast feedback from emulators and simulators by running functional flows, use touch actions, or change GPS. This fast feedback can also be gained because the simulators and emulators are easy to scale. Then you have the first layer for real devices. This is where you focus more on visual validations, the leftovers, and usability. And in the last layer, we would focus on the non-functional requirements like performance testing. I'd like to thank you for watching this talk about the mobile test pyramid and how to utilize our continuous testing cloud to give you more and faster feedback when you need to automate mobile web, hybrid, and/or native apps.